Have you ever been trying to use SAUDA and she just keeps dying? Well, that's because you're probably using her wrong. SAUDA is one of the more complicated heroes in TD6, and today I'll be teaching you how to use her effectively. Just a quick disclaimer. Most of these tips are intended toward chimps, and more specifically expert chimps. You can probably apply these tips onto basically every difficulty though. So, let's get started on how to place her. Since she has very short range, you're going to want to place her on bends, or corners, or loops, places where she can use her limited range to the best of her ability. There are usually multiple spots like this on beginner and intermediate maps, and a lot of advanced maps as well, but on expert maps there aren't very many places like that, which is why she's less commonly used on expert maps. Except a few though, like Quad, Dark Dungeons, and Ravine. She is also best used on maps with overlapping tracks, like a lot of beginners and intermediates, a few advanced maps, but for the expert maps it's going to be Quad, Ravine, kinda, and Workshop, also kinda. This is because if the tracks are overlapping, then Sword Charge can hit Bloons multiple times and deal a lot more damage. Now, let's cover a few of her very important levels that you should keep track of. Her main important levels are her levels where she gains abilities, so 3 or 10, 11, and 16. At level 11, she gains extra damage versus Bloons that are taking damage over time, slows, or stuns. These bonuses are insanely useful to her kit, as she barely does any damage without them, and there are pretty easy ways you can obtain all of these buffs. For the most important one, the damage over time buff, a really easy way to obtain this is with the Dragon's Breath Wizard, as it can apply damage over time to many Bloons consistently. Conveniently, it also covers her massive ceramic weakness in the mid-game, which I'll explain later. And an easy way to get the slows and stuns is with Relentless Glue, because that tower's overpowered. And then level 16 turns Sword Charge from mediocre at best to actually a fairly strong ability that can be used for some very needed cleanup. Let's talk about SAUDA's general strengths and weaknesses. For her strengths, she is very good early game, basically solos all of the mid-game ceramic rounds like 63, 76, and 78, and does very respectable Moab damage late game. However, she has quite a few weaknesses that you should look out for. Her short range is probably her biggest weakness, but she has a few others. Like, as I mentioned earlier, her general weakness to ceramics if you're not using her abilities, which you should, they're very good, and the fact that she needs a decent bit of support if you want her to solo one of 2 Moab lanes, for example. So, let's get started on how to actually use her in a game. You have to decide one thing first. Are you going to use her as a set and forget hero where you just place them early game and let them do their thing? Or are you going to actively use her abilities and allow her to do a lot more damage than if you used her as a set and forget hero? If you're just using her as a set and forget hero where you don't want to use her abilities and just want to use her, you're probably on a beginner or intermediate map, because if you're using her on an advanced or expert map, you're going to want to use her abilities for her to actually be the best option. So, once you've decided that you're actually going to use her abilities and not be lazy, you're going to try and get her down early game as soon as possible. Some maps you can even start with her, but usually you'll be able to get her before round 15. And on many maps, she absolutely dominates the early game. Like, she can basically solo almost the entire early game on many maps. The only thing she really needs is a source of lead popping. But for round 40, you're going to need a little bit of Moab damage, but you won't need to worry about the ceramic cleanup inside because her level 3 ability can insta-kill those. But then after round 40, she kind of falls off until she gets level 11, because she just doesn't do enough damage to be able to keep up with the Moabs, so she can be relegated to just some basic cleanup at this point. Which is why getting a Dragon Breath Wizard is very good, because it basically solos this part of the game, and it'll turn into a value addition once SAUDA reaches level 11. During this stage of the game, you're probably going to be saving up for your mid-game carry, to where you'll start saving up to your main tier 5 damage dealer of the run. And you won't have to worry about 63, 76, and 78, because SAUDA can basically solo those using just her abilities. If you use Leaping Sword on the first wave, Sword Charge on the second wave, and another Leaping Sword on the third wave, that basically just solos 63. And 76 and 78 are just insta-killed by Sword Charges. so yeah. And on most maps, SAUDA will reach her level 11 around 65 or 66, which is very good as this is when her level 11 is needed for her to actually be able to do significant damage for the harder Moab rounds of the mid-game, like 71, 75, 77, and 79. And speaking of round 79, this is probably when you're going to have afforded your main tier 5 damage dealer of the run, and that should be able to solo most of the early 80s, because SAUDA still doesn't deal a ton of damage yet. So now, we'll fast forward to the early 90s, where she should have level 16 on basically every map, and Sword Charge is now a monster at cleaning up Moabs and DDTs alike. And speaking of DDTs, SAUDA does very good damage against them, with and without her abilities. And if we're on the topic of her abilities, might as well talk about Leaping Sword. Leaping Sword is insane because it deals really good damage to just any form of Moab and ceramics if they have damage over time applied to them, and especially if they have a glue or just any slow, and stuns applied to them, which you can get with Relentless Glue, as I talked about earlier. Once SAUDA reaches a lot of her higher levels, with just a bit of support, like maybe a Moab Press or two along with that Relentless Glue and that Dragon's Breath, and a tiny bit of cleanup like maybe a Spiked Balls or even a Spiked Mines, SAUDA should be able to completely solo one lane if there are multiple lanes that have Moabs on them. And if there is only one lane with Moabs on them, she'll still do pretty good damage with that. Overall, SAUDA is a very strong early game hero and can deal a lot of damage in the mid and late game if used correctly. I hope this helped you out in some way. Have a nice rest of your day. Goodbye.